Welcome, everyone. I'm Eric Protesnik, chair of the Political Science Department, and it is a pleasure to have you here today. So let me introduce today's distinguished speaker. Herman Mark Schwartz is professor of politics at the University of Virginia. He is the author, editor of numerous books, including States versus Markets, The Emergence of a Global Economy, Subprime Nation, American Power, Global Finance, and the Housing Bubble, and In Dominions of Debt, Historical Perspectives on Dependent Development. He's written over 60 articles that have appeared in leading outlets, including World Politics, Comparative Political Studies, Politics and Society, and the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. He's been a Fulbright Scholar and a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Society, the City University of London, among many other institutions. He received his doctorate from Cornell in 1986. So I had the pleasure to be Mark's colleague at UVA for 14 years, I think. During our many lunchtime conversations at various joints on the corner, I learned a tremendous amount from Mark, not only about how to be a productive scholar, but also about a wide variety of substantive topics, including how to think about the American political economy in cross-national perspective. He's one of the most creative, playful, and interesting thinkers I know. Mark is never afraid to refine or challenge the conventional wisdom or flip an argument on its head. He's tolerant of ambiguity and always on the lookout for good ideas, whatever their origin. And he's fiercely dedicated to discovering the empirical truth about any given situation and learning what the best available data shows, even if doing so complicates received understandings. On a more personal note, I can thank Mark for the generosity and spirit of his kids, who taught my kids to play Magic the Gathering, which proved to be their gateway drug to Dungeons & Dragons and Legends of Runeterra and many other nerdy strategy and role-playing games that greatly expanded their horizons and helped make their childhood far more stimulating and exciting than it might otherwise have been. So welcome to Brown, Mark.
Thank you, Harry. What he said about the personal stuff is true, but the rest of it he got from the Herman Schwartz, who's at American University. I don't recognize this person. Thanks also to Mark for organizing Mark Blythe for organizing some of the hosting, and thanks to Deirdre for actually making sure that everything worked, like that I had a hotel when I arrived. That is not a given, usually. So I'm going to talk about like what it says here. Why is the dollar dominant in the world economy? Actually, why is it, in the minds of many people, the question, still dominant in the world economy? It's a bit of a long ride, and the audience is actually like horizontally spread out, so sorry if I'm not looking at you all the time. I don't know why it's set up this way. This is pretty bad. I would complain to the architect. So if I'm saying something that's confusing, you can put your hand up and ask me questions in the middle. That's political science questions, not economists' questions, okay? But you're going to have to wave because it's quite likely I'm looking like in the wrong direction, okay? Are we good? Okay, so let's start with what the average person thinks. In this case, the average person, of course, is in finance because they have the money, so we care about what they think. And they were pretty sure the dollar was in deep trouble for the second, third, fourth time, because it turns out a lot of times the dollar has been in trouble, according to people. And they did eventually change their mind. I mean, that's a good sign. It took more than 10 years to go from this, that the dollar is doomed, to actually the dollar is pretty strong. So great for them. Academics also had the same attitude, and so you don't have to read the words here. I would just say, look at the names, right? So very early on, Robert Triffin is saying the dollar is doomed. He was pretty consistent. 20 years later, the dollar is doomed. This is after the Nixon shock, when the dollar goes off gold. The world, meaning the IMF and the people that countries that matter, go on flexible exchange rates. And then actually, Charles Kindleberger in 1981 is saying, look, the dollar's done as international money. Very pessimistic. And then 30 years later, William Klein, who's a DC apparatchik, is also saying in DC language, there's a problem with the dollar. This is, very moderate public consumption, but what's behind it is the dollar's messed up, okay? And what they're worried about was this, which actually is, in principle, should be very worrying, right? If we didn't have that US bit in the yellow part of the slide, or down here, and we just had no idea what the country was, a typical banker would be saying, maybe we should take our money out of this country, right? We should not extend credit to this country. Consistent and persistent current account deficits, a continuously worsening net international investment position. This economy is in trouble, and so its currency clearly is one we should trade out of rather than trading into. But of course, here we are, 2024, and we have people, a guy who's now chief economist at high up in the IMF, saying it's a dollar-dominant world. The reality is dollar funding is what holds up the global financial system in terms of banks. It's what non-financial corporations fund themselves in. Trade, invoicing, anchored against the dollar. Everybody has reserves in dollars. So the question is why, and the answer is you won't get the answer from the economics textbooks, current company accepted. So read him, don't read the Econ 101 textbooks. Because what you're seeing is a problem of how to conceptualize what the dollar is doing. So the very short version here is that if you think all countries are equal, if you think money has to have a commodity basis, if you think that savings precede lending, you will get the story. And if you think that a current account deficit for the country that emits the key currency, or as I will call it, global quasi-state money, and I will explain what that is. If that's the way you think about the world, you will get it wrong about what the dollar is doing in the world. And that's because the dollar is global quasi-state money for the US global empire. A couple words about money, okay? If you have cash in your wallets right now, you probably think that's money, and I'm happy to check and make sure it's not counterfeit. Just bring it. You can put it on the table here. I'll get to it after the thing is over. But the problem is that cash is a very, except if you're a drug dealer, cash is a very small part of the supply of credit in the world. What we mostly deal with in the world is credit. Credit is assets, liabilities, right? It's always a two-sided relationship. If I have an asset, it means someone else has a liability. They owe me something. If I have a liability to them, they have an asset. Most, quote-unquote, money is actually credit. It's balance sheet entries. Most of those balance sheet entries at the international level are in dollars, okay? So as I'll say later, because repetition will help you remember what I'm saying, all credit is all money is credit, but not all credit is money. And what I mean by that is that I can give you an IOU, but you cannot take it to one of the non-existent coffee places on campus. Why? And get a cup of coffee, okay? But there is a debt there, right? I write you an IOU, you have an asset, but you can't necessarily spend it. So what's special about the cash in your pocket is that it always trades at par. And the problem with credit, and this is where dollar dominance comes from, the problem with credit is it doesn't always trade at par, meaning at its face value. So here's where we're going in the rest of the talk. After that very brief, here's the essence of what's going on. First, I'll give you some data on dollar dominance, so you know why we're actually talking about it. Then I'll talk about two theories of money and credit, basically an expansion of what I just said, which gives us two different theories of dollar dominance. And then I'll give you some talk and data on how we know the dollar is dominant and why it is linked to empire, why it's quasi-state money. And then, since everybody's interested in the challenger part, I'll say a few words about that, even though it's the least interesting bit. Once you do all this, this is easy. Although I wrote a bunch of things with Randall Germain about this, so it's not like I think that's unimportant. Okay, so settle in. We're going to use the whole 40 minutes here. Okay, so dollar dominance. All you have to see in this chart, which is kind of cluttered, is the blue bars. What percentage of bank balance sheet, claims and liabilities, assets and liabilities, is denominated in dollars? What percentage of bond markets, foreign exchange reserves, denominated in dollars? How much trade invoicing is denominated in dollars, right? Just look at the size of the blue bar. And if you look at this, right, trade in Europe, invoiced in euro, I will say what you're missing here, what you don't see here, is actually we shouldn't even have that bit of bar there. Germans buy French cheese. It's denominated in euros. It's actually not really an international transaction. It's a unified money area. So this is data from the Fed. If they actually calculated this properly, that 23% would be much, much, much larger. When you stop to think about that, right, we're not talking about pick your favorite emerging market developing economy, which occasionally has political instability, doesn't quite get to the global quality standard that you would expect if you're buying something here, right? You would kind of think, well, that's kind of normal that they should trade in dollars, use dollars for invoicing. But we're talking about Europe here, right? It's not just a theme park. They actually make stuff. And so why are they using dollars, right? That's a puzzle. When you look at global bond issues, dollars, which are the red bar here, more denominated in dollars. There was a catch-up around the time of the crisis, and then, of course, there's a drop for everyone. But after that, because of the euro crisis, way underneath. Again, you would expect these are real economies. They should be there should be people who want to borrow money in these currencies. Cross-border banking liabilities, same story, right? Mostly U.S. dollars. Also important, look how stable that is, right? If we zoom out a little bit, this is 35-ish years, 33 years, 38 years. Yeah, 28 years. Not a quantitative scholar. 28 years, pretty stable. Also important, some heterogeneity. So this is the most recent quarterly data. Same thing, cross-border bank liabilities, and you'll see why liabilities matter in a minute. It varies for countries. Unsurprisingly, Germany, France at the center of the European economy. A lot of euro liabilities, but again, really should net it out. Everywhere else, banks have lots of dollar liabilities on their balance sheets. Okay. So what's going on here? What's going on is that in the American political science literature, there's a view of money that misleads them about why the dollar is dominant. And so for sake of just having some words to say, right now I'm going to call that a North American view and contrast it with a new European view. But quite obviously, there's scholars on both sides of the Atlantic. Much of the new European view comes from Perry Merling, who's obviously on this side of the Atlantic. And what I want to focus on in this list of things right now is this bit, because this is where most people get messed up. The first thing they get messed up is that money is mostly these pieces of paper. But the second thing is what actually happens in credit markets. So the North American view, or the monetary theory of credit, generates a loanable funds theory of credit, loanable funds theory of lending. Credit theories of money have what's called an endogenous credit creation model. And the issue here, the confusion in people's heads, is the idea that for banks to lend money, someone has to put money into the bank first. Banks are just intermediaries. They're kind of passive in this process. They're going to make money off of it, but someone's going to do savings first, like this guy. He's going to, well, he doesn't put it into the bank. This is regulation, such nonsense. But he puts this money into the bank, puts these cash into the bank, and then the bank lends it out to somebody. And so in a loanable funds model, you have saving first. It goes into the bank lends the money, someone borrows the money, they spend it, and then on the other end, the person getting that money saves some of it and puts it into the bank again. So savings is coming first. Keynes already said this is not the way the world works back in the 1930s. Schumpeter also was saying back in the 1930s, this is not the way the world works. There may have been people before that, but I'm too young to read anything before 1900. So what they're saying is if this is true of the world, we would have persistent and constant deflation. I have $100 that comes from somewhere, and I'm going to consume $80 of it buying chai lattes at the non-existent coffee shop on campus. And because I come from an echt Deutsch family, I'll save 20% of my income. So I save $20, and I put that into the bank. And I don't actually come from an echt Deutsch family, but that's why we do endogenous credit. But I save the $20 and I put it into the bank. And the bank now is like, okay, great, we have $20 of deposits. We want to lend it out. Who are we going to lend it to? I'm the producer who wants to sell stuff, but there's only $80 of demand out there. And we've just satisfied it. Why would I borrow $20? Right? This was Keynes' insight that if everybody saves, if we have an economy that generates $100 of income, but people choose to save 20 of it, demand falls, aggregate demand falls, investment falls, and the savings are destroyed. They can't find a home. The bank has no place to put it on the other side of its balance sheet. They can't lend it out. So these guys say, where do these savings come from? And where does it's credit, not money, right? Where does the credit come from in the economy? And what they say is banks create money. There are no prior savings. Banks create money. And what they mean by that is that literally banks are creating money not out of thin air, and certainly not out of the generation of pieces of paper in their basement. What banks do when they make a loan is that someone comes in and says, I have collateral. The bank says, great, we'll make you a loan. On the bank balance sheet, they record, this is all units of account, they record an entry. You owe us $100, that's our asset. We owe you the $100 that we create as a deposit. That's how you get your money from the loan. And symmetrically, on the other side, I'm not going to flip myself around, it's bad form. But symmetrically, on the other side, on the borrower's side, they have a new liability. They owe the bank $100, and they have a new asset, which is they got a deposit for $100. And then they can go spend that money, which is somebody else's income, which become the savings that will come back because, right, when they spend that money, this deposit is going to evaporate from the bank, but it comes back into the bank. If we only had one bank, right, this is easy to understand. We have lots of banks, and at the micro level, the world looks like a loanable funds model. If I'm a bank officer, I spend a lot of time worrying about how do I make sure at the end of the day I have enough deposits to balance out my, because those are liabilities, to balance out my assets, okay? But at the macro level, this is what's going on. Banks are creating money. And here's the problem. When they create money, when they create credit, there's always a problem of acceptability, and there's always a problem of excess creation of credit. And this is where central banks come in, okay? So Minsky, right? Anyone can create money. The problem is to get it accepted. Right? You can't spend that money. There's multiple reasons why you can't spend this at the non-existent coffee shop, but the biggest problem here is that behind that there's nothing. So what are we really seeing here when banks create credit? What we're actually seeing is a political structure of power. We're seeing a structure of power. It's not just economics, there's politics here. Acceptability comes from multiple sources. Some of it is, as the old views on dollar dominance would say, yeah, private actors will accept this, but that raises the question of why they accept it. We know why instruments in the US market are accepted. We know why instruments in the European market, the Euro things, are accepted. There's a state behind it. And there's a state behind it for two reasons. Reason number one is that states have to fund themselves. So they will, this, by the way, for those of you who know these terms or want to know these terms, this is a chartalist view. Reason number one is that states need to fund themselves. They fund themselves through taxation. For people to be able to pay taxes, they have to have something. So states will say, this instrument is acceptable as tax revenue. And the question of, do I accept it as a private actor? Do I accept it for taxes in real life, as opposed to academic debates, is a process of coevolution. So these polar opposite positions, private actors accept money or accept credit instruments, and state actors accept certain things for taxation purposes. You can construct polar arguments about which is more dominant, but in real life, what you actually have is an interaction of these things. So again, if we stop and think for a second, right, how many people have frequent flyer miles? That's a credit, but you can't take it to the non-existent coffee shop and do anything with it. Private actors won't accept it. You can't take it to the IRS and do anything with it. The airline will accept it, so some private actors will accept it. All those pieces of paper that you carry around, right, they say legal tender for all debts, public and private. That's where you see power in its rawest form. The state is saying, you must take this money, okay? They could print that on here, but it doesn't always work. So credit, which includes cash money, credit is ultimately a political thing. Credit is a claim on future behavior, which could include the production of goods, that is ultimately enforced by the state. And secondarily, because not all instruments are assigned, this is good as legal tender, people, private sector actors, have probability calculations in their head about whether or not this credit instrument will actually get them what they want in the future. So two things here. One is, if it's about the probability that an action will occur in the future, what we are ultimately talking about is state capacity. That's why that's not just useless because it's $100 trillion, but because nobody believes that this state can actually do anything. Okay, whereas the US state quite clearly can, but again, so can the Europeans, et cetera, et cetera. Probability that it will actually happen. If it's a private instrument, it's the same calculation. Everybody there? Okay, and here's where it interacts with banks creating credit. If you're in a bank at the micro level, you will not get your bonus unless you beat the average. If you're a bank, you're going to maximize profits by expanding credit. And as Minsky said, this is great at the beginning because the expansion of credit is self-confirming. I come in with collateral, I get a loan, I spend it, everything looks good. Second actor comes in, asks for a loan with the same exact collateral. Oh yeah, no problem. Actually, we'll make you even bigger loan. So they're creating more money. It takes a while for the supply of things to catch up. Prices start rising. Collateral values get better and better with each cycle until actually we've created too much overvalued collateral. And then we are in the situation of what Minsky calls Ponzi finance, where people are borrowing money in the expectation of capital gains that only exist if there's some stupid person willing to pay that price. And eventually we run out of stupid people who, anyway, have a credit rating that can get them into the bank in the first place. That's 2007, 2008, for those of you who were alive back then. But it's also every other financial crisis, okay? So second reason why we have why this is ultimately a political issue and a question of power, is that when that crisis happens, who's bailing out the banking system? And the easy, obvious answer, wow, yeah, central banks bail them out. And the reason central banks can bail them out is states can create money also. What central banks are doing is just what banks are doing, except they're not facing a balance sheet constraint. When central banks bail out the banking system, what they're doing is, right, here's the banking system. We'll just, again, aggregate everything. I'm a bank. Here's all the banks. I have liabilities that are at par. I have assets that used to be at par, but now they're devalued for some reason. The collateral value has collapsed, or companies have gone bankrupt. So for me to be in balance, my assets are what make good on my liabilities. For me to be in balance, someone has to revalue these. The state comes in and revalues them by taking them off banks' books with this money that they create by pushing buttons. So to simplify things, in 2008 and onward, what the Fed did was say, hey, nice mortgage-backed security you have there. You've got $100 of liability. You have $100 of mortgage-backed security. The market says it's worth $70. You have a problem. But we don't have a problem. We'll buy it for $100. Now you have $100 on your asset side, $100 on your liability side. You're good. Central bank now has an asset worth $70 mark to market, but central banks don't go bankrupt. They don't care. Oh, wait. Central banks of states that have state capacity don't go bankrupt. So there's a hierarchy of central banks. There's a hierarchy of states. So if we look at the universe of credit instruments, we have a hierarchy of instruments. And at the top is the instruments that are issued by a state that has enough political power, or, because we're talking about the world, military power, to guarantee that this claim will be made good. All good so far? Okay. All right, so we can go back to these two views. The old view says this, and this is the view that says, wow, the dollar is not sustainable. Current account deficits, rising foreign debt. If you have a belief that money has to be anchored in a commodity, so for those of you who know this literature, Triffin, right, has to be gold out there. Money has a commodity base, or money itself is a commodity, or states can create fiat money, but all states are alike. If you have a loanable funds model of credit, if you have a model in which it's only private actors that decide what money is acceptable, what credit is acceptable, you would see problems with the dollar. If you have a view that says, no, money's credit, there's a hierarchy of credit instruments, those instruments are anchored in a state that has enough domestic capacity and global political military power to make good on, to replace instruments that are devalued in the inevitable crisis that comes out of endogenous credit creation, that it itself is anchored in a society that supports its actions, then things look a lot different. Then you start to have to ask a bunch of other questions, like what happens when actors that fundamentally want to tear the state apart get elected in 2024, okay? Which we've also seen. What happens when a state walks back from its willingness to back up all of the instruments that are floating out there? This is the, so again, for those of you who know the literature, this is the Kindleberg's, partly the Kindleberg story about the 1930s. The British walk back their willingness to back up claims. We'll do it for our empire. The rest of you, sorry. Okay? So what happens is you have problems. Okay. So the North American view is anchored in this view of the world that says money is a commodity. Countries issue currencies that are competing with each other in the global market for acceptability by private actors. Those private actors are judging acceptability on its utility in transactions. Because the credit's already there, right? The savings happened. There's no hierarchy of credit instruments. Some of them are not this bad, but make a caricature, okay? But they issue these currencies, and the currencies are linked to what BIS folks call the triple coincidence, which is that here's an economy with its own currency, its own legal system, its own production system, and these are little islands. And when we have a balance of payments deficit, what we're seeing is a transfer of savings. Oh, we echt Deutsch responsible households have produced 100 BMWs, but we only want to buy 80 of them. So we'll lend you Americans 100 BMW worth of money so you can buy these BMWs, right? We're moving our savings from one place to another, right? The money is pre-existing. The savings are pre-existing. Credit is pre-existing. Right? That's the view of the world. And so in that view, these private actors could decline to accept that currency, or they are like looking at, well, what does it cost us to do business in this currency? What are the transaction costs, right? So the private actors are deciding what's being used. And in that view of the world, something like a foreign exchange reserve would be an indicator of power or an indicator of problems, which is why, again, if you read in the Economist or Financial Times, oh, the share of dollars in foreign exchange reserves has fallen, the dollar's obviously in trouble. But it makes no sense. And in that world, the balance of payments constraint is strong. If you run out of money, you're in trouble, unless you have these foreign exchange reserves. But we don't here. The US deficit is a feature, not a bug, as I like to say. So in the New European view, the dollar is quasi-state money for a global empire. We don't have island economies. We have an integrated global financial system. Okay, asterisk, there's some countries out there that are not really in there. Some of them are not there because it's just like we have people that are not bankable in our own economy or have to rely on payday lenders. Not all economies are in. Some are oppositional, but basically, like you saw earlier at the beginning, most economies are in. The economies we care about are in. So we have a globally integrated financial system. Currencies are not substitutable. There's a hierarchy among currencies. And the problem for the system is that, as Kindleberger said, you have to have some lender of last resort, some central bank that's going to back up all of these currencies that are linked to the dollar, which is most of them, okay? So when you're looking at the world that way, what you would say is, we want to actually see where's credit created, who's creating credit, what denomination, and who's backing up that endogenous credit creation. And you would also say, if we have a currency that is at the top, the country that emits that currency, or that emits the country whose unit of account is used to denominate those credits, is going to be immune from balance of payments problems because it's at the top, its money is always acceptable, its credit is always acceptable. And then I would add to that the Klein and Pettis argument, which is late development gives you chronic deflationary pressures, and so you need somebody to back up new credit to make the system work, and the problems ultimately are political, not economic. So how do we know that this is so? So I use this empire word, I've thrown this empire word out, and I've said quasi-state, right? Because the point I want to make is, we live in a world in which there's a power hierarchy. The US at the moment is the center of that power hierarchy. It does run an empire. Get out of your heads. Get out of your heads. Empire is like, oh, here's the Belgians in the Congo. And get out of your heads, Star Wars, here's Darth Vader or Princess Palpatine, whatever it was, who has some master plan. And get out of your heads, the center snaps its fingers and things happen. That's not how empires work. What characterizes empires is these three things: hierarchy, asymmetry, heterogeneity. It's a structure of power. It's built on centrally organized cooperation between central elites and elites in other countries where there's an overlap, in this case countries, where there's an overlap of interests, there's very often a lot of domestic autonomy for those subordinated polities. When you look at the British Empire, again, you will think because of many bad movies, here's the British and the British Raj in subcontinental India. But you also have to remember, like, oh yeah, Canada, the Australian states, South Africa, the South African states, these were part of this empire also. They had essentially full domestic autonomy. They issued their own currencies side by side with British pounds. Oh, but, and here you can start to see the buts, it's the pounds sterlings that are the ultimate reserve in the banks, okay? Bank of England controls that. They have full domestic autonomy, but the Privy Council can overrule local decisions. They don't have full autonomy over their own militaries. Actually, some of them don't have militaries. There was no military in Australia for many years once you're past the convict era, right? When you look at the world today, again, you don't think, here's the American proconsul sitting in, whatever, Frankfurt or Berlin, I mean, actually it used to be this way, tapping on the shoulder of someone in Bonn, but tapping on the shoulder of someone in Frankfurt or Berlin saying, here's what you're going to do. That doesn't happen, right? These countries have some form of autonomy. For those of you who went to Cornell, which is some of us, Peter Katzenstein, remember, wrote a textbook on Germany, semi-sovereign state. These are semi-sovereign states. Two things here that I'll do very briefly, but you can ask me in questions. If you look at the structure of NATO, you'll see a hierarchy. What you see is that none of the other actors, meaning not the US, none of the other actors in NATO can actually do anything without US command and control elements, without American logistical support, okay? They can opt to do nothing, which is what you see in the Gulf of Aden right now. But if they opt to do something, what happens is what happened in Libya in 2011. We've been fighting for a week and now we're out of ammunition. Who's going to help us? The Americans are the ones who generate the ammunition. So hierarchy, okay? Asymmetry, American military relations with different countries are different. That's the heterogeneity, and the asymmetry is we do the command and control. With money, okay, we have a hierarchy. Everyone deals in dollars, and I'll show you some numbers in a minute. Everyone deals in dollars. US financial instruments sit at the top, and most US fixed income instruments, which are the building block for all the derivatives and repo, are actually public debt of one form or another. Asymmetry, for those of you who know how swaps worked in 2008, were all in one direction. The Fed bailed everybody else out. Nominally, these swaps are bilateral and equal. Maybe the Fed needs to borrow euros at some point. It can go to the ECB and borrow euros. But, you know, to give you the only movie reference I'll give you, you know, this is Pulp Fiction with the guy looking around, right? Why is the Fed going to need euros, okay? So we bail folks out. And heterogeneity, again, in the money area. With the swaps, you can see 4 different sets of countries based on how important they are to the US. So that's the heterogeneity here. So there's a first tier of central banks. 5 of them, that's an error, but sorry. But 5 of them that have, as it says here, automatic, unconditional, unlimited. If you're the Bank of England, if you're the Bank of Canada, you need dollars, you can draw an unlimited amount of dollars automatically from the Fed. That's the way the swap is set up. If you're here, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Brazil, and Mexico, which are, like Sesame Street would say, 2 of these are not like the others. But if you think about why they're in the group, Mexico, Brazil, and Korea, sorry. Why are they in those groups? They're obviously very important for geopolitical reasons. But Automatic, unconditional, you can go in, but it's quantity limited, $30 or $60 billion. If you're not in these groups and you have treasury bonds, you can go to the foreign International Monetary Authority and do repo. So it's not automatic. You have to have treasury bonds to repo. And it's limited. If you don't have, it's limited to what you have in terms of treasury bonds. And it's time limited. It's overnight, although they will renew it. And if you don't have treasury bonds, well, you're in the payday lending system. Okay? So global quasi-state money. There's a global financial system. There's a hierarchy of credit instruments. The central banks of these other countries are semi-sovereign. They are linked to the Fed in this hierarchy in an asymmetrical relationship. Not all of them get the same deal. So like Eric said, I believe in numbers a little bit. So just so you can see that I'm not making this up, although I am making all of this up. So if you talk to the Eichengreen's, et cetera, of the world, they have a mantra: why is the US dollar used? Transaction costs are low. American capital markets are deep and liquid. Okay. On face value, that seems pretty reasonable, right? You can see that, right? These are the average share of global equity markets and fixed income markets denominated that are issued by US entities. So almost 40% of fixed income, 42% of equities. This number's higher because these are from 2021. But whatever, it's still a big number, right? Keeping in mind that the US is about 24% of world GDP. These are outsized, okay? So, okay, on sort of a superficial level, it makes sense. Yeah, okay, it's going to be easier to transact here. If you then ask, well, what are these things? Where do they come from? Which apparently nobody really does. You start to see something interesting, which is why quasi-state money. I'm going to say 40% because it makes the math easier, but 40% of global fixed income instruments are emanated by US entities. And remember, they're the building blocks for everything else, okay? All the repo, all the derivatives are basically built on that building block. What are those instruments? 75% of that, so 30% of the world fixed income market, are instruments issued by the US state or guaranteed by the US state, explicitly or implicitly. Treasuries, obviously. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So mortgage-backed securities here is only Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and a little bit of public housing, Ginnie Mae. Agency debt is direct lending. So these are guaranteed by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. And Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac these days are renationalized. But again, we know because they were renationalized that even when they were quote unquote private, they were backed by the state. This is their direct borrowing, okay? And the municipal bond market, the Fed up until COVID would not guarantee anything there, but in COVID they did. So 75% of that fixed income base is government securities. This is how you see that the state backs the system. When you look at equities, what you see is a bunch of firms whose existence depends on possession of intellectual property rights, in other words, monopolies created by the state. This is a shout out to my older work, you know, because I only have so many ideas in my head, but here's the S&P 500, again, 2021, just to keep everything consistent. So this has changed a little bit, but 400 firms in the S&P 500 are 41% of the market capitalization. The rest of it is firms that are very closely connected to the state. Again, their existence depends on those intellectual property rights, or they're hand in hand with it, right? Do we think that Intel, which is basically being bailed out by the federal government through the IRA, is somehow separate from the state? Do we think that these platforms, which collect all of our data and of course would never send it to the NSA, FBI, et cetera, without a legal and valid search warrant? Now, that's not how it works, right? And then the software companies, right? So this is the top 100 firms. This is the firms in these sectors from the top 100 firms, and they're the bulk of market capitalization. And it's actually gotten more concentrated since 21, okay? So that's the money side, and now here's how the power operates. This is from what we just saw was mostly from the US side, right? But why do other countries buy in? So two kinds of Hirschman lock-in. Albert Hirschman, back in the Second World War, wrote a book about how Germany used actually both trade and finance to lock, before the war started, to lock Central and Southeast Europe into its economic orbit through asymmetry of trade. Basically, these countries depended on Germany more for their trade than Germany depended on any one of them. Same thing here. So as Klein and Pettis have shown, and also as I said in subprime, countries that have trade surpluses, current account surpluses, rely on those trade surpluses to grow. If they don't get the surpluses, they can't grow. And so here's the lock-in. I run a trade surplus. Someone created credit out in the world market. They're not creating credit in my currency. I'm Germany exporting to the US. Okay? The American buyer of the BMW is going to buy the BMW with dollars, and then we have a problem. Here's the problem. They buy with dollars, but my costs are in euro. Oh, I can hedge some of that. I build some BMWs in South Carolina. But ultimately, at an aggregate level, I'm running this big surplus. So here's a pile of dollars. What am I doing with them? I could bring them home and spend them, but as an Echt-Deutsch household, my mom, Angela Merkel, says, no, we must save this. No. What they're saying is, if we turn these dollars into euro to consume them here, right, the value of the dollar is going to go down. It's just, right, supply and demand. The value of the dollar is going to go down. The value of the euro is going to go up relative to the dollar. We won't be able to export. We'll have no net exports. We'll have no growth. So we're going to forget that. What we're going to do is recycle those dollars back into buying assets in the US. Oh, right. It's that US, that's all US state paper, or these industries that are based on state created monopolies. So we recycle the surpluses and we do it in dollars. And again, if you're one little country, you can diversify, but in the aggregate, those dollars have to end up somewhere. Financial side, same thing. We recycle those dollars. Some of them are recycled directly into assets. We buy treasuries, but some of them are recycled into the banking system. And the banking system is also creating credit endogenously. So all of these non-US banks end up with balance sheets for their cross-border lending that have all these dollar liabilities because of the deposits or because of the money they create. And so you have a problem. Now, warning, okay, warning. When we look at these imbalances, right, the US is half of global current account deficits from 1992 to 2022. The surpluses are oil, which I'm happy to explain later if you want to ask a question, but it makes this talk too long. But just trust me, this has to be recycled into some kind of asset. And then these folks, right, the usual suspects. And this is kind of color-coded, like the stuff that's basically Greater Germany is kind of in the brown. The stuff that's kind of Greater Asia is kind of in the green, although that doesn't really look very green. So maybe it's the projector, but, right? So these folks, in the aggregate, are going to have to recycle those surpluses into dollars. And what that creates is the dependence on the Fed that I talked about. So first point, asymmetry. Most of them are losers. All those red underlined countries are surplus countries. They all underperform over the 75 to 17 era and also the sub-periods. They underperform the US for their foreign investments. which is totally crazy if you think that there's something wrong with the U.S. economy and the dollar. Totally crazy. Point number 2, we know that again, Keynes, in a normal capitalist system, Keynes and Schumpeter, that we're going to have chronic deflation. I used to use the VW Golf for this, but it takes too long. This is actually better, because you all know, you've all sat in one of these, right? Yeah, but I mean, right, there's chronic deflation. Okay, this is real dollars, right, adjusted for inflation. What the U.S. current account deficit does is put more demand in the world economy. It's the reason that these other countries don't have deflation. They get growth because of that current account deficit. That's that's where you get this lock-in from. It's the additional aggregate demand, and that's all done by endogenous credit creation. And again, it's endogenous credit creation in the U.S. in dollars. We don't endogenously create credit in euro here, okay? And so those dollars end up in financial systems of the non-U.S. banks. So this should be updated, but I'm lazy. But I don't think it changes much over the next 6 years. But the proportions of global credit creation generated by, of non-domestic U.S. dollar loans created by U.S. banks versus non-U.S. banks, right? You can see it's mostly non-U.S. banks, typically 80 to 85%. In volume terms, to give you an anchor here, as of 2017, there was about $12 trillion a year of new credit being created for cross-border lending. That's about 50% of what the U.S. economy was domestically creating in credit. So that's a lot of money, right? And most of that money, right, sits on the liability side and also the claims side of these non-U.S. banks. So here's the currency breakdown, right? Point of which is that these banks here are creating a lot of U.S. dollar denominated credit, and that U.S. dollar denominated credit is a lot of what they do. Because again, this thing here is euro credit, and this is, hi, I'm a Dutch bank, I lend to an Austrian firm to buy Italian wine, and that should be netted out. And when you net it out, this is what the picture looks like. Most cross-border lending is dollars. Most of that lending is non-U.S. banks. When they get into trouble, as they inevitably do, Minsky is right, they've got to turn to the Fed. Okay? I'm going to skip that. And so why the dollar is not in trouble, why Gurrinchas can say, yeah, it's a dollar-denominated world, and all those people who are like, this is not going to work, look at the deficits, are wrong, is that the dollar's global quasi-state money, okay, for a global empire. Global, I showed you the data. Quasi, the U.S. is not a state for the world in the sense that the U.S., you know, that Washington, D.C. is the central state for the U.S. Although increasingly, given what, you know, the governor of Texas thinks, you could maybe make an analogy. But there's no formal taxation power, but we run this big current account deficit, which is a transfer of real resources. The BMWs come in. The Chinese active pharmaceutical ingredients come in, right? We consume them, we give back pieces of paper. There's no compulsion to use the dollar, except for a very small number of instances, but all these countries have domestic political constituencies that don't want their currencies to rise, so they use it. And it's state money. Again, endogenous credit creation in the U.S. and offshore in dollars creates demand, and it locks other systems in. So the U.S. is the outside money that backs up the financial system. Okay, great. All right, so here's the bit about competitors, which should now be obvious, you know, what the issues are. So first, even if the old story were right, it's not a story about transaction costs. Folks in the financial industry are not sitting there every night thinking about, can we lower our transaction costs by 1/4%, 1/4 of a basis point, which is 1/100th of a percent. They're looking for gains. U.S. economy outgrows almost everybody over this 92 to 2021 period, right? So this is not, we had a good year. This is very consistent. So the blue here is real local currency terms, which matters for domestic politics, and the red bar is in current US dollars. So the Australians had a great 20 years, thank you, China. Taiwan had a great 20 or 30 years, thank you, Apple. So there are some countries, 20 million people, 30 million people. So 2 Virginias, 3 Virginias, that outgrew the US, but all these surplus countries, which should be growing faster, they've got trade surpluses, right? Should be a huge source of demand for their economies. They're not growing faster in either sense, you know, either local terms or dollar terms, okay? And then also for political matters, nobody cares about, how many of you care about aggregate growth as opposed to your own paycheck? Yeah. On a per capita basis, again, yeah, the Australians had a whole bunch of great years. But even when we put this into purchasing power parity terms, the US is outgrowing these surplus countries. So just from that level, you would expect money to flow into the US, and it does. Or put it differently, the way I would prefer to put it, folks are willing to accept US dollars, credit instruments denominated in US dollars, because you think it's going to be validated. The US economy grows. Unlike some of the obvious competitors, right? So here's Japan's share of world GDP, shrinking. The euro, which was the more plausible contender, where's the state? Remember, this is also about political power. So states are lawyers, guns, money, and nationalism, or I could say lawyers, guns, money, and God, small g God, right? No fiscal base, and as we can see today, unfortunately, or since 2022, no serious military power. The cocktail party statistic of the month is that the Russians lost more tanks retaking Advika than most European countries have in total. So on the wrong side of differential growth, on the wrong side of relative growth, the social base, which includes institutions, right, is not in favor of having the euro appreciate. And they're a little bit uncertain about what to actually do in the face of a really, really big challenge, right, which is this thing. I mean, really big. Again, Germany, I think, is about 25% of European economy. 25% of the German economy is manufacturing, and 22% of that is cars, and about half of that is VW, okay? And so this is gonna just gut that industry. It's not just, hi, I'm VW in Germany, it's all the subsidiary plants across Europe, all the suppliers, okay? So not a plausible challenger. There's no state to do the role of global quasi-state money. There's noise about substituting some kind of BRIC currency, but as many of us now realize, there's no such thing as the BRICS. And you can see it right here, right? So, oh yeah, US does sanctions, but we still want oil. How about if you take some rupees, Russia? And lots of uses for rupees. You can buy jasmine rice, you can buy call service for your many consumer-facing industries. 2 months later, yeah, no, that's not happening, right? These countries are not a coherent whole. It's not even clear that they could agree on a common Bancor-like or SDR-like currency, okay? So what we're really talking about is China, and again, problems. There is a state in China. It actually has military power. I will say to you forthrightly that if, and maybe I would strike that through and say when, we had a conversation about this at lunch, the Chinese decide to invade Taiwan or do something to Taiwan, the US will lose that fight in the sense that it will not be able to protect Taiwan. So China minimally is clearly a regional power. China clearly on the production side is the power, right? And so here we have the problem, but also part of the answer, which is, okay, China is 30% of world manufacturing. Its trade surplus is about 4% of world GDP. Is that sustainable, right? The flip side of this is, that's the creation of a claim. The flip side is liability. And the flip side is whose manufacturing is gutted by this. So my reference point here is Australia, but the word comes out of Brazil. The Brazilians now talk about reprimarization. Reprimarization is a return of the economy from being an industrial economy to being a primary product exporter. 5% of Australian employment is in manufacturing today. Most of Australia's economy is rocks and food for the Chinese economy. There's reprimarization. There's no more Australian car industry. That's not politically sustainable. But the problem here for the Chinese is, if it's not politically sustainable, what happens when these countries say, well, we actually want to do manufacturing again, which is, in this country, the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act. And so the answer is, there's going to be a problem. So the real problem here is, for the US, is not trade deficit. The real problem is not rising foreign debt or worsening net international investment position. The real problem is this: who's managing the global quasi-state money, right? That's the problem. Because as these two folks said a long time ago, if there's no domestic consensus to maintain this order, it's going to collapse. And I would add to that, if the people who are running the state are a little out of touch with reality, there's going to be big problems. These folks are actually very out of touch with reality. So thanks for coming. If you want, you can go off and have coffee at the non-existing coffee places. You don't have to stay for questions and answers, but there is going to be Q&A. Don't be shy, raise your hand.
Yes, and I should say there's a reception afterwards, but let's take a few questions first.
Yeah. Okay. 1, 2, I don't know people's names, I'm sorry.
Hi, it's Brad Gibbs, I'm in the economics department.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you wouldn't mind commenting on effectively our weaponization of the dollar in connection with Russia, Ukraine, and whether or not you think there are going to be long-term consequences when we try to shut people out of the payment system.
Yeah. So the answer there is structure or strategy versus tactics and individual actions. So the really important thing here is that this weaponization of the plumbing for financial transactions only works if your currency is actually the one that's being used. So the structure here is the use of the dollar. That, I think, is much more durable than specific bits of the plumbing. There will be a reaction. We actually have already seen it, which is, oh, you can turn the plumbing off. Maybe I'll build a different pipeline. But if I go back to, oops, wrong direction. If I go back to this, right, there are limits to how much can flow through that plumbing. That would be the answer. So I'm trying to keep these short because I know Eric is hungry. So this guy was first, and then 1, 2, and then I do know Peter.
One is, will we have access to these slides? You share lots of information. I'd like to look at them. Is that possible to be available?
For $100 or your firstborn child, no, schwartz@virginia.edu. You can send me an email. The other thing you can do is the 3-hour version. The earlier 3-hour version of this is up on the Max Planck website, slides and audio. But schwartz@virginia.edu, I'll send you these slides.
Thank you. Second question to digital currency, Bitcoin, et cetera. Will that have any impact on the dominance of dollars? What's your thought?
No. Bitcoin is garbage. There's no state behind Bitcoin. right? I mean, if the Fed were to say, if the IRS were to say, we'll take Bitcoin as payment, different story. If the Fed were to say, we'll back up banks that are transacting in Bitcoin, different story. If the non-existent coffee place said, we'll take Bitcoin, different story. But right now, Bitcoin, all those crypto things, it's just, as somebody once said, burning up the planet to sell heroin for those eigenvector twins that were in the movie Social Network. Digital currencies is actually the same question over here, right? The question is, what's the denomination? China, if you do digital currencies, you can bypass some of the plumbing, right? Because the plumbing right now is two things. One is the actual transaction through chips, which is in the US, or the FedWire, again, which is in the US. And so the the sanctions work because if I'm India, in the old days, India buying oil from Russia that's priced in dollars, the Russians send me an invoice through SWIFT, but the money then goes through chips, okay? SWIFT, in the weaponized interdependence thing, listens to the US because the banks in SWIFT are afraid of being sanctioned, and the banks run SWIFT. So digital currencies can bypass that, but again, for how much? And again, I don't want you to think empire is 100%. 70% is pretty good. 60% is pretty good. You can control a lot of stuff with that. This row, yeah.
So, thank you first. My question is about China, but I got to start with Germany. So Germany, this already told us, I think, if I've got it right, is that it's a net exporter, has this big trade surplus that causes sort of bad things to happen to its economy because it has to recycle some of its money in US dollars. And so I'm wondering how that story plays for China. That China is a big trade surplus net exporter, has been for a long time, and it's been growing at a pretty incredible rate. So is there some bad thing coming in the future, or is there something different about Germany and China?
So China has an enormous amount of catch-up growth. The growth rate is much higher. The commonality here is what Klein and Pettis identify, and again, which I talked about in the subprime book. These are all, in some sense, late developing economies. This has to be very compressed, I'm sorry, but to actually do late development, you have to compress domestic demand in order to generate investment in the industries that will get you developed. That suppression of domestic demand gets built into your political economy, which is why I point to Volkswagen, right? If Volkswagen is some big percent, I mean, Volkswagen alone, forget Continental, Daimler, BMW, Bosch, Siemens, right? That's where the political power is in the society. So what's their interest? Their interest is we can't sell all the cars we make here in Germany. We have to export them. We're selling a price-sensitive good. Again, in our heads, we're thinking Porsches, but it's a lot of VW Golfs. I have one. And those are price-sensitive. If the VW Golf cost $25,000 when I bought it, I would have bought the Civic. Right? And I'm not a typical consumer, but I mean, like, that's what typical consumers will do. But the actual non-anecdotal bit is Baccaro and Pontusson have done the math, and their argument is Germany exports mostly price-sensitive goods. Yes, a lot of stuff from the Mittelstand, sure, but a lot of it is price-sensitive, and not all. So because it's price-sensitive, they don't want the euro to appreciate. And so that's why you get the recycling. The same thing's true of China. I don't have the slide on this deck, but if you graph the yuan versus the dollar or renminbi versus the dollar, yeah, we want to do it this way, yeah, so you can see it. There's a huge devaluation in '94, which triggers the Asian financial crisis because it substitutes Chinese exports for Thai, South Korean, et cetera. It comes up a little bit in response to the crisis. Good actor. And then, for those of you who know how foreign exchange markets work, you can graph this. It's like a perfectly straight line for 8 or 9 years. Minimal volatility. It's a managed currency post-devaluation. So they undervalue their currency. The pain here, just like the pain in Germany, is if I undervalue my currency, then my consumers have productivity that's not being realized as consumption for them. So, and this is the thing I think that most people don't get about the Klein-Pettis argument. The point is not that German workers are underpaid, and the point is not that Chinese workers are on starvation wages. The point is that their wage, their household income, is lower than their productivity by more than, let's say, some notional profit margin that we would expect firms to have in order to survive, and minus a kind of normal level of taxation. That's the pain that they feel. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I'm still wondering, like, why is the economic outcome good for China and bad for Germany?
It's all, well, because they're super undervalued relative to their productivity. I mean, Chinese wages, you're too young to remember this, but like I was actually born in 1900, so I remember when Chinese wages were like essentially zero from our point of view, right? A U.S. garment assembly worker in the American South was getting paid all in, okay? Maybe $12 or $13, $15 with experience. The Chinese worker was getting less than $1. There was not a 15-to-1 productivity advantage for the U.S. worker. There was not a 15-to-1, subtract the 30% of extra logistic costs involved in dealing with China, right? I mean, so those people had productivity that was way higher than their wage. Did this generate growth? Sure, because they got a lot of demand, employment. It increases aggregate demand in their own society, which leads to backward linkages, forward linkages, leads to normal Keynesian expansion. So I teach development, and one of the mantras is I come into class with is Ragnar Nurk's poor countries are poor because they're poor. Sounds like nothing, but what he means by that, that's what that is saying is they have low aggregate demand. Because they have low aggregate demand, you won't get investment. Because they don't get investment, there's no increase in aggregate demand, and they stay poor, right? The Chinese get this extra aggregate demand from the exports. It accelerates growth. So, I mean, so this is not a story about everything is bad or everything is good.
Hold on, I think was Peter next?
No, this guy was the next. Peter, and we're out. Okay.
Yep, go ahead.
I think this is very powerful and very compelling, but I'm wondering how you reconcile your story of the persistence of the dollar as the reserve currency with the story of the origins of the dollar as a reserve currency and displacement of the pound that's not a tautological sort of just so story of the most powerful state has the biggest empire, has the reserve currency.
So World War II ends. So Eichengreen and Flandreau argue that the US dollar is becoming the reserve currency in the late 20s, early 30s, which I think is true if you say reserve currency, right? In the sense of foreign exchange reserves. But I don't think that's all that important, right? The real question is what's credit being created in? And in the 1930s, no one was creating credit. That's why we have a depression. So the story starts after World War II. After World War II, the U.S., for geopolitical reasons, wants to rebuild Europe and Japan. And on the European side, the U.S. Tied Marshall Plan aid to use of the dollar as the key currency in Europe. And that was through the European Payments Union. So Marshall Plan aid, so the European Payments Union was, so Europe has a dollar shortage. Oil's priced in dollars because we control, American companies control oil. Oil's priced in dollars. Also, not non-trivially, food is priced in dollars. We're the exporter of food. You want these things, you need dollars. Europe has a dollar shortage, which means any individual European country is sitting there looking at the other ones saying, we have to maximize our export surplus in order to conserve our dollars and to get dollars so we can buy these things. From a US policy point of view, that's bad because you want the Europeans to cooperate against the Russians, Soviet Union. So the US makes the Europeans set up a clearinghouse to conserve on dollar use. And to conserve on dollar use by actually, in principle, not using dollars. So central banks on both sides of the European, let's just say both sides of a transaction, would hold each other's currency. I'm a French exporter. The Germans are buying something. My central bank will hold those Deutschmark and give me franc. and eventually we'll clear them through the EPU. And at the EPU, they would settle these balances, and then they would credit countries in what they literally called the unit of account. And the unit of account was one-for-one translatable into dollars. So already before everything else, they're locked into using dollars. So it's not a just-so story in the sense of here's a deductive argument about financial systems. There actually is a historical story about why dollars are put into place as the central currency, which comes from the power side, which is why I say the empire word, right? If it were an Eichengreen story. So Eichengreen says, oh, look, digitalization means it's easier to transact in different currencies. Dollar usage will go down because you can just buy anything you want with my phone, with any phone, okay? But that's not actually how it works, right? It's about this, can we create credit, will be accepted. But the initial thing is, you're gonna use this because we're here protecting you. And if you want this Marshall Plan aid, you're gonna do it this